Welcome to Fire University. This is a podcast dedicated to fire ecology and management within the Natural Resource University Podcast Network. My name is Dr. Marcus Lashley. I'm a wildlife biologist, an assistant professor of disturbance ecology at the University of Florida, and a lifelong hunter that's passionate about wildlife conservation and management. In this podcast, I will interview scientists and professionals, not only on the latest research in fire ecology, but also about their experiences, in hopes that you as the listeners can learn why fire ecology is important and also how you can use it to meet your natural resource management goals. So let's get to the burning questions in Fire University. Welcome back to Fire University, everybody. Today, I have Sam Fuhlendorf and Bob Hamilton with me, and I'm pretty excited about this because these folks are pretty far west from where I am, out in Oklahoma, and I haven't talked to anybody out that far west yet, and I think they've got a lot of great research and a lot of great experience that they can bring to the podcast, and really wanted to pick their brain on managing some plant communities that you may experience down in the southeast, but they certainly experience a lot of in prairie and old fields and that sort of thing. So how's it going, Sam? It's good to see you.
Very, very well. Glad to be here.
Yeah. And Bob, this is our first time meeting, but really glad to have you, and definitely an impressive resume that you have with all those acres burned. So we'll be excited to hear what you have to say about that.
Yeah, great. Thanks for the invite.
So, Sam, do you want to introduce everybody to who you are and what you do?
Thanks, Marcus. I'm glad to be here. My name is Sam Fuhlendorf, and I'm from Oklahoma State University. I work on sort of the interface between rangeland and wildlife. I'm originally from Texas, went to school at Angelo State University and Texas A&M. Have been at Oklahoma State University for about 23 years. I've enjoyed sort of thinking about grasslands from a private land standpoint, but also from conservation perspective.
Yep. And Bob, you want to tell us about yourself?
Yeah, Marcus, I'm Bob Hamilton. I work for the Nature Conservancy in Oklahoma. I'm stationed at our Tallgrass Prairie Preserve, about 40,000 acres, kind of in the very northeast corner of Oklahoma. Sort of we're embedded within the southern end of the Flint Hills, which we'll probably touch on in terms of the significance of that, in terms of kind of the fire culture and what we're able to do with fire. But I'm the director of the Tallgrass Prairie Preserve, and so on the ground management, and then also land protection work and conservation planning for the region.
Yeah. So you get to set things on fire quite often.
Yeah. It's a nice recreational sort of thing.
Yeah, I've carried a drip torch around for various reasons, but a lot of fun doing that.
Yeah.
So one of the reasons I really was excited about having you guys on is because of how much experience and research you've done related to fire, the use of prescribed fire to manage plant communities, how fire interacts with herbivory. I've done a fair amount of work with white-tailed deer down in the southeast related to that topic, but I think you guys have a really cool perspective and a really interesting research that has come out on this topic, just looking at the interaction between fire and herbivory and how important that interaction is in some of those prairie systems. So, Sam, I was wondering if you wanted to talk about that a little bit. I think it was you that coined Pyric herbivory.
It was me that coined Pyric herbivory, and some people would claim that it's because I was just trying to get some grant money, and that might be true. But it's also we were having a hard time. If you think from a researcher standpoint, when you say like something like fire grazing interaction, everyone thinks that you're talking about a statistical interaction. So you have fire, you have grazing, you have fire and grazing, and so it's like it would be just a uniform plot where fire and grazing occurs. So I really struggled more communicating with other scientists than I did with the public about it. And so that's really the argument behind coining the term Pyric herbivory was to try and say that it's one process that's more about spatial interaction, and we could give it our own definition, and it wouldn't have so much baggage from some people.
So what is the definition of Pyric herbivory then?
Well, so the actual interpretation of the words, so Pyric is formed by fire, and of course herbivory is grazing or browsing, and so the point is that fire and grazing aren't independent, and they're tightly coupled, and that you can't talk about one without talking about the other, even though we've mostly spent most of our time trying to decouple them.
So in other words, when we're studying fire and herbivory, we would have a treatment that is only fire, and you don't let herbivores in.
Right.
You have a treatment that's only herbivory and don't let fire in.
Yeah, and in fact, it was even worse than that, because out west there were agency policies that if you wanted to burn, you had to destock before you burned, and you couldn't restock for 2 years after the burn. And if it burned from a wildfire, you couldn't allow grazing animals on it immedately after the burn. So
you weren't even allowed to let them interact from a management standpoint.
Right. So it wasn't just sciencey people trying to argue about it, although that was a big part of it. But it was actually the fact that the sort of culture of rangeland management was, fire bad, and we have to let the system recover before we can graze it, associated with that. So I had a big interest in that, and then the heterogeneity idea that, just you need variability across the landscape in order to manage for different things and so forth.
Yeah, I remember you giving a talk in a symposium that I was hosting one time, and you used a word for that. What was that word?
Heterogeneity, is that the word? Or
no, there was a longer word, I think, that.
Oh, Phantasmagoria.
Phantasmagoria. Right. Yeah, you know what? That actually was the word of the day yesterday on my dictionary app.
That's actually how I got interested. I mean, that's how I found it, is that my mother always told me that I had a really bad vocabulary. Oh. And she told me I should get dictionary.com to send me a word of the day, and then I should try to use it. And of course, I just delete it all the time. One day, Phantasmagoria came across, and I thought, well,
so you really did find it. I was just kidding.
I really did.
I really did.
I did. And
that's hilarious.
And so I read it, and it was, I don't remember the exact definition, but it's like a shifting series of stages, and I was just like, that's what I'm trying to do. So,
So then you gave a presentation at the Wildlife Society meeting that the title was Phantasmagoria.
Yeah, it's to
try to spell that again.
Yeah, right. Yeah, and as I like to joke, I was going to, the way I envisioned it was that I was going to create a new discipline, and it was going to be Phantasmagoria ecology or something like that. And then I would be the father of Phantasmagoria ecology.
Yeah. Never did catch on.
Well, I Googled it, and that word's already, I think it was like a Marilyn Manson album, and it's been used a lot. So it wasn't original to me. So maybe I was a little slow. Not that that music couldn't be a part of it, I guess.
Yeah, that could be like the cover music of your
right
of your web page when you open it or something.
Yeah.
So I know you've done a lot of research in that area. I guess when you've been working with Sam and you're trying to work out these questions with research, how much of an impact has that made on the way that you do things, I guess, from the practitioner standpoint, when you're trying to conceptualize what you're going to do out in the prairie, and manage those communities? I mean, how has this affected your viewpoint and I guess your management techniques when you're trying to encourage, I guess, that interaction rather than separate them?
Yeah, it's been an interesting evolution, I guess. I mean, working with the Nature Conservancy, of course, what we're trying to do with our properties is to support and maintain biological diversity. And in these Great Plains systems, the recognition by grassland ecologists is that grazing and fire were two of the primary forces that impacted this landscape and created it.
So you're thinking of it like a historical perspective.
Yeah, kind of historical.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you start with the kind of the soft, warm, fuzzy vision sort of stuff.
Right.
Then, like you say, as a land manager or a practitioner, where the torch hits the grass is the interesting part of, how do you bring that to life now?
Right.
The pre-settlement vision, is we had this just helter-skelter sort of landscape, fires happening all different times of the year, Native American set fire, lightning strike fires,
right.
Patches being from, the size of your living room to Nebraska, and just this very unfettered, like I say, shifting landscape patch mosaic is
right.
kind of buzzy.
A Phantasmagoria, I think.
There you go. Yeah. but how you make that in how do you make that happen in terms of a managed system is a little more challenging. As a fire practitioner, we are using prescribed fire, of course. We have to be able to manage that force. You just can't throw matches and let her go. I've had people ask me that.
Yeah.
Oh, you just throw matches on a windy day and just see what happens. Well, that's tough on the career. Can't really do that. You get one of those, right? And
folks frown upon that.
Yep. So how we manage fire, how we put fire back in spatially, where it happens, and temporally when it happens in terms of the different seasons of fire, that's where it gets, I think, elegant. Kind of this.
Yeah. It's a good way to put it.
Interplay, yeah. And then you throw grazers on top of that, of course, and that resulting heterogeneity or patchiness out there on the landscape has proven, in our situation here anyway, we've most of this work being done by Oklahoma State, but we're up around 200 scientific publications that have come off the preserve over the last almost 30 years.
Wow.
It all seems to be telling us this heterogeneity focus in terms of trying to maintain a very patchy, shifting sort of landscape that's working very well for us in terms of our currency being biological diversity. So so I think our partnership with Oklahoma State especially has brought and you can tell from Sam, this refined, more sophisticated approach. I mean, that's what he's all about, right? He's a sophisticated gentleman, yeah. But kind of this deeper understanding and appreciation for trying to manage the whole grazing fire interaction. So it's an ongoing process, of course.
Yeah, both of you keep bringing up shifting mosaic and heterogeneity. So for our listeners who are trying to envision what that looks like, what are you talking about from the, I guess, if we took one management unit, what does that look like within that unit? And then if you broke up the property, let's say into 10 units, how does the heterogeneity and mosaic play into those two scales, I guess, of inference?
Well, I guess I can start, but Bob could pile in at any point. So early on, I was trying to learn all I could about wildlife and plants and everything and fire. And I remember seeing an early paper, I think it was from the 70s, that talked about the kind of habitat you have to make grassland bird habitat. And basically, for some of the birds, you had to have tall grass, and for some of the birds, you had to have short grass. You had to have bare ground. You had to have different structure depending on. So early on, I remember struggling with that and thinking, well, well, I guess you just can't have all of it.
Right. There's always winners and losers. You got to pick one.
And then, of course, if you think about it even more, you can carry that out further and say, well, you can actually have them all. You just have to have variability out there that's managed somehow.
Right.
And then you have what Bob was describing, how these landscapes may have operated historically. And so all of that built up to what Bob was actually already practicing, but we decided to try and put some data to with the help of GPS collars and things like that, and collect data on biodiversity as well. But the idea that these animals are actually, the grazing animals are seriously attracted to recently burned areas, particularly bison and cattle.
So when you burn, basically all of the herbivores are seeking out the burned areas, what you're saying?
Yeah. And in fact, the rangeland culture was such that people were anti-fire because they'd seen wildfires occur, and then the animals would congregate on those and just abuse it. And it looked like it just never recovered from the fire, but it was largely, so it created a culture where if part of a pasture burned, you were either supposed to fence it off or burn the whole pasture or just completely destock it.
Right.
And so we carried that knowledge and sort of asking, well, if that's where the animals like to graze and we need to get fire on the landscape anyway, maybe we can use fire and get the animals attracted to a burned area. They heavily graze that burned area, but there's other parts of the pastures they actually avoid, and you grow up a lot of grass. That helps all the species that need a lot of biomass. And it just sort of moves around the pasture. Now, it's different than a rotational grazing system because it's a lot of years in between it being heavily grazed, whereas a traditional rotational grazing might be a matter of weeks or months before the animals get back to a patch. And so you're trying to get this variability where you have an area that's been heavily grazed and recently burned, and an area that hasn't been burned or grazed for several years, and then everything in between. And Bob had sort of initiated that on the bison unit, and then Bob and I got together with some others and started talking about, well, how can we translate that into a principle to discuss from an ecological perspective, and then in addition, how could we come up with management ways that we could help landowners actually manage their land. So there's a lot of what Bob does that isn't exportable to the general public.
Right.
So to try and find some things that might be. I don't know, Bob, did I leave anything?
Yeah. We never thought our whole fire bison interaction unit, we never thought that concept or that model was going to be real exportable to especially the private landowners around us. Most ranchers aren't interested in switching to bison. I mean, it's a little different market, a little bit different handling. And probably, the way we're using fire, all different seasons, it's a little bit of a pointy headed, exercise to try to put Humpty back together, as I think of it, in terms of the original disturbance regime.
Right.
So yeah, getting together with Sam and Dave Engel was, of course, a big part of the whole thing. But yeah, some of these great thinkers out of OSU, as Sam mentioned, then the conversation became, what have we learned from kind of the fire bison model? How can we come up with models to manage domestic livestock more creatively, to maybe get more habitat diversity out there on the landscape to support biological diversity? And that's where Sam and others have coined the patch-burn-grazing.
Yeah, patch-burn-grazing. I wanted to get to that. So essentially what you're saying is now the idea is, okay, they're not necessarily going to have bison, but there are plenty of folks that have cattle, right?
Right.
Probably almost every landowner out that way.
Right.
Yeah.
So the idea is that you could use fire and the cattle together to sort of mimic what used to happen with fire and bison.
Right. And in fact, so Bob, the bison unit at the Tallgrass Prairie Preserve, it has random fire, or at least if it'll burn. So, and the fire unit, it's real messy. So, and that's what makes it really cool. But you start thinking of telling a landowner, oh, just go light something on fire and see what happens, and
just pitch matches out on windy days.
Yeah. And so we started trying to think, and we're still thinking about that. Well, what parts can you throw away and still get most of the benefit? And there's a lot of really interesting things. Some of them we thought would happen, and some of them we didn't think would happen when we started doing this. And some, are like when you get into drier rangelands, they have a problem. If you graze, you can't burn, and because they don't accumulate fuel. But if you don't burn the places where the animals are, even though it's all in one pasture, then you've actually overcome this sort of fire fuel paradox, and you've actually you can have both, or fuel forage paradox, I guess.
Yeah.
And so it's kind of like all of a sudden it sort of makes me argue that if you're in a fire dependent system that's going to be grazed, the thing we should be talking about is how to make that part of one unified management strategy instead of two separate discussion topics that bump into each other every now and then, and you have to figure out how to make them work.
Right. So when you burn and you remove all that vegetation, and then plants start resprouting or germinating in that flush of green, that's what the herbivore, which regardless of which one it is attracted to, right? So why are they attracted to that? Is it the plants are actually higher quality?
Yeah. So crude protein, for example, is like 4 times higher on a recently burned
4
patch.
times. Wow. Okay.
Yeah, depending on the time of year. But there's other benefits that we never imagined. So like animals that have access to a burn patch that forage on that have lower tick loads.
Oh, so even parasites are wiped out. Yeah.
So there's a lot of little things so it's kind of hard since we can't ask the bison why he's grazing there.
Well, let me ask you this, Sam. If I put your favorite meal on a table, well, let's say I have your favorite meal on 2 plates. One of them is twice the size of the other one. You normally would pick that, but if it was on a plate, this on a table full of ticks, you'd probably still take the smaller steak, I'm guessing, or whatever.
I think I would. It depends on how hungry I am. But
yeah, I can see that line of reasoning why they might avoid the tick infested area.
Sure, and and some of those things we didn't necessarily think about early on, and you just think, well, wow, we got these animals in, and there's no ticks on them, or
Yeah, just like a gee whiz thing that happened, then you realize you need to study it. Yeah.
Yeah. So you have to call somebody that actually knows something about ticks all of a sudden.
Yeah, I've actually had to do that about ticks myself. So
yeah, right.
Somebody. Yeah. So that's really interesting, and I guess so the quality of the vegetation, and then other benefits like not getting infested with parasites obviously make it a very attractive area. But what you were saying earlier with the biomass, is that traditionally what people were using to measure quality? I guess like this pasture is great because there's more biomass there.
Yeah. So
from the cattle perspective,
it's curious because what they would argue traditionally is that most everyone knew that low biomass was high quality, and that high biomass was low quality. But they assumed that it was sort of a more linear relationship. And we actually studied that. And Brady Allred, a former student of mine, he found that basically it's a relationship that's almost like the shape of the graph. Basically, if you have 0 biomass, then you have really high quality forage. If you get much more than 0, then it gets really low really fast.
Yeah, so plants grow and mature really quickly.
Yeah, and so the challenge really was, that sort of made me think, well, so the old way of arguing was, well, then you don't want the vegetation to get too rank or it won't be high quality, so you're trying to get it in the middle. But that's because they didn't appreciate heterogeneity. So if you actually realize that you can have patches, if you have, they can get quantity from one patch and get quality from another patch, so they can even mix their diet some.
Okay, so like if you burned a pasture and it's heterogeneous, like you're saying, basically you'd have the fire sort of meander through it, and you'd have unburned patches, or you may intentionally do that. I guess, Bob, you can even. put fire breaks in place to make sure that fire doesn't get into some areas, or how are you?
Bob can make fire breaks.
Yeah.
Yeah, we can just manage fire. We can bend it to our will. No, but yeah, I mean, typically when we're talking patch-burn-grazing, how you implement it on the ground with cattle, usually what you do is you take a pasture, whatever size unit you're dealing with, break it into thirds or fourths or whatever increments you so desire, and those are fixed burn units then. So most of the work, well, Sam can get in this. We've experimented on the preserve with, from complete burning of pastures, burn the whole pasture, up breaking a pasture into 8 different cells or 8 different units, and then this is managed with cattle grazing in a more regimented fashion. But yeah, typically you have, with cattle grazing anyway, you have fixed burn units, and you rotate those. It's through the seasons or through the years, depending on what you're doing, but kind of fixed, controllable type units. The difference being, like Sam mentioned, in our bison unit, it's much more of a helter-skelter, fluid sort of system where it's much more of a random. I think of it as kind of designed chaos, is how or managed chaos. That sounds
managed
chaos. Yeah.
Yeah. And some of the ranchers that have applied it, they'll just use roads. So sometimes their burn patch is really big.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's really small, and it's been hard to translate to the public, because some of our research sites, when we started, we made the patches all the same size, and it looked like it was really difficult to do, because everyone sort of interpreted that means you have to go out there and have square patches that are all the same size. But
right.
But over time, we've gradually found that there's actually quite a bit of slop in the in the process. You don't have to have exactly the same size and shape.
When in fact, it sounds like to me it's preferable that you don't have the same sizes, or you don't necessarily have them even on the same fire regimes.
Right.
You may mix up how long since fire and whether or not their cows have an excess.
Right. Exactly. And, I mean, the point, if you think, if the bison were in charge of the burn program instead of Bob, how would they burn?
Yeah.
And, they'd have to, first of all, have thumbs. But
yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, you never know. I guess I shouldn't. But they, you kind of get the image that they would like to be burning a little something almost every day.
Yeah.
And which I think would be cool if we could rig that up where they could pull that off, Bob.
Oh man.
You're
breaking up, Sam. You're breaking up. I can't hear you.
You're breaking up. Yeah.
You could get like a little saddle that sits on top with fuel, and then their tail, and kind of
or
drip
maybe
it out
you
around.
could get like a monkey to ride on the back.
Yeah.
That would attract some attention at least.
Yeah.
So one thing that, being someone from the South, it's really easy for me to visualize what heterogeneity in plant communities looks like in Florida, or, in another state that's forested. But it's a little bit more difficult if I'm thinking about prairie, for me to think about that. So when you're talking about heterogeneity and structure, there's nothing that's over shoulder height at a maximum, even, right? In the tall grass prairie.
And that's rare. So,
right.
I mean, there are some shrubs, but for the most part, you're talking about the majority of the biomass is, less than a meter. And so it can
waist high or lower.
Yeah. And so you're creating, and I've even done some work in short grass prairie where you're talking the heterogeneities between 6 inches and 0.
6 inches and 0.
Yeah.
And so when you're talking about diversity, and whoever wants to respond to this, please feel free. But let's say we're in a system where we have the heterogeneity is all generated between 0 and a foot tall. that is having a tremendous effect on which wildlife species are using it or which insects. What is driving the biodiversity changes that you're seeing between those two?
Bob?
Good. Well, I was like Sam, you alluded to it. I mean, even in shortgrass prairie, just those what we think are pretty minuscule differences in biomass and height, amplified a little bit more in the tallgrass, of course, but especially for some of our native wildlife, like our grassland nesting birds, boy, they are really keyed in onto biomass levels. They don't care so much about the composition, in terms of what species they're nesting in.
Mm-hmm.
So it's primarily the structure. And so, yeah, there's a lot of research out there showing during the breeding season and in the off season, in the dormant season during the wintertime, the grassland nesting birds that we have here, boy, they are really keyed into that variability in biomass, and you'll have starkly different species on different patch types. And so again, if you want all of our native brethren to come along for the ride in terms of providing them a template to persist, as a land manager, that's the challenge, is to maintain all these different patch types all the time.
Right. Yeah, so if we take one bird species, that bird is actually choosing different levels within that matrix for different things, for different habitat components.
Yeah.
Okay.
And what Bob and I like to say, that birds aren't botanists. They're not out doing MID. They're actually, although we come back and often for our bug friends say that bugs are botanists. So species do matter for some things, but for birds, it's really just the structure, and they'll key. And it to somebody from outside, it looks fairly subtle. But for those of us that work in the system, I'm not a very good bird identifier, but I can tell you what birds are going to be there because we've studied them, and the habitat, it sort of dictates it all.
Right.
But the other related point that I think sometimes I forget to relay, because it's where I'm from and the background I have coming through the rangeland discipline. The other point about that is that one of the principles of managing rangelands is to make it homogeneous.
Yeah.
And
it's by design, you want it to be.
Yeah, you don't want anything too disturbed or anything undisturbed. You want everything to be really lightly disturbed.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's where it's really difficult to translate to the community, because they've basically been told that the opposite of what we're telling them now is what they should be managing for. And that, and there were some reasons for that. It's not like they were just totally wrong. It's just that things have changed, and people are interested in stuff they weren't interested in.
Yeah, so that would be like a high input system where the traditional, I see that down in the deep south as well, where that's the idea, is to have improved pasture grasses, and you have stocking rates and other inputs that are going into that system. But what I wanted to, I guess, pivot off that a little bit and think about is, okay, they were told to do it that way for a reason. That's a very effective model to produce meat for beef or whatever. What about what you're talking about with this patch-burn-grazing? How does that compare in terms of the productivity from the beef cattle standpoint? If a landowner is managing cattle but also has an interest in diversity or wildlife?
So when we first started this, I think one of our intent, at least the way I thought of it, was that, I was pretty sure it was going to be the right thing to do for conservation of for things. And then I thought, we ought to be measuring weight gain so that we can record how much we hurt that, so that, if we, that, and
how much did we lose?
And what we found is that very rarely did we ever hurt animal performance. And quite often we improved it, and it sort of depends on what you compare it to. So in Bob's part of the world, some of the local management is burn everything every year and double stock it early, and then you get off it and grow more grass so that you'll be able to burn it again. And the truth is, when that works, you can't get more weight gain than that. So
in that model, you're actually burning the same pasture twice.
you just burn it every year, so once a year,
every spring.
Every
spring.
Yeah.
I got you.
And then when it works, it's as good as it gets. But the problem is, when it doesn't work, you lose a lot of money because you've got a lot of animals out there, and so what we found in that case was that when it works well, we can't gain as much weight by burning patches.
Mm-hmm.
But when it doesn't work, we gain just as much as we did. As there's no relationship between rainfall and how much weight gain we get. So you get a flat line, whereas with the more intensive management, it's highly dependent upon rainfall.
So the Patch-Burn-Grazing model, if I'm hearing you correctly, is much safer from year to year variation in rainfall or whatever.
And if you compare it to a place where they don't burn at all, then you actually get increased weight gain because the forage quality is higher. So
right.
So that's I don't know, what is that, Bob? Probably the better part of 20 years of research that sort of goes into that conclusion.
Yeah. And I think I can just to add a little bit to that. I think what you're doing with patch-burn grazing is by not putting all your eggs in one basket, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
Cattle in one basket. The metaphors are a little clunky.
Prairie chickens.
Good size bucket.
No, prairie chickens in one basket. Yeah, you're hedging, and so you get what can happen in this part of the world is either you get a droughty situation, it'll turn dry, and you just don't get that. The regrowth just does not come on as aggressively from that freshly burned grass, or you'll get a real cold spell. So we'll have a week, 10 days where the sun doesn't come out. It's just wet, cold, rainy, and those warm season grasses. That's what you're trying to stimulate with that real early spring burning. You're trying to kickstart. The blue stem grasses and the switchgrass and Indian grass, but they just kind of go into torpor because the soil temperature goes down, their photosynthetic rates goes down. So, and you've just doubled the number of cattle you normally have out there. And so they get to where they're locally, they'd say, they start chewing on each other's tails. So, and if with that double stock system, you only have 90 to 100 days to put on your gains. So typically the cattle are introduced in mid-April. They leave mid-July, so you're shoving all your chips into that one bet. And if you have a little bit of, like Sam says, if you have a little meteorological challenge, they start going backwards pretty quickly in terms of their rate of gain, and you can lose a lot of money fast, or you can make a lot of money fast, just depending on how you shake out.
And early on, Marcus, I mean, actually, the way you asked this question was you said one unit, and then what if you had 10 pastures or managed? That's sort of my interpretation of that part of the world. Well, it makes sense that since you can make a lot of money doing what they're talking about doing, that you might want to do that on some pastures sometimes. But you probably don't want to do it everywhere to hedge your bet. So basically you'd have patchiness within a pasture, but then you would have patchiness across pastures.
Yeah. And, so you'd have I think the literature from Australia calls it an invisible mosaic versus an actual mosaic.
Yeah.
So you have one mosaic that's actually created by the way that fire is spreading in the system, but a secondary mosaic that we have more control of is where you put the fire.
Yeah.
Based on which burn unit.
But they are confounding challenges because so the traditional focus of rangeland conservation was build more and more fence and make smaller and smaller pastures. Well, that just makes it that much harder to have fire and grazing interacting. Because you can't, if you have 20,000 acres and you need to burn a third of it a year to keep woody plants out, and it's divided up into 100 paddocks, it's really hard to figure out how to burn that third. You can't burn a third of all the pastures because I think, and there are some ranchers that have been taking fences out and making pastures bigger so they can do this. So
I got you.
it's interesting to watch.
So, most of the listeners, I think, are generally, at least based on the feedback that I get, interested in wildlife and thinking about that. And I think we've covered that pretty well. That in general, this increasing heterogeneity is really good for wildlife. But what about for some of those that are less interested in bird watching, but more interested maybe in some of the consumptive uses? So how are some of those species affected, like deer and turkeys, and I guess you have grouse and quail there as well?
Bob's the chicken expert.
We have, in this part of the world, we have the greater prairie chicken is our native grouse, and they're interesting because they are a year-round resident. They don't migrate. So the chickens that we have in the neighborhood, they are here, 24/7. And what we've found, historically, I mean, when I took Wildlife Management 101, what you learned was, prairie chickens had tremendous site fidelity in terms of where they do their reproductive, all their displays, the booming grounds, where the males come to do their dancing and show off for the girls, and the females trickle in, for breeding. And the conventional wisdom was those sites, those were hardwired on the landscape, and those chickens kind of had their own internal GPS, and they would come back to that lick location, that booming ground year after year. Well, yeah, under conventional management, that's the way it works. But what we found on the preserve is with this shifting landscape patch mosaic, where we're moving patches around, that short structure. I mean, part of what the males are selecting for is patches that have very minimal residual cover when they're doing their booming in the early spring. They actually start in the fall, kind of practicing. And you can't show off for the girls in that big grass, and so
I've never seen a chicken do that, but I've seen a turkey do that.
Yeah. So you got to have the right dance stage, to show your stuff. And so what we found is, as you might expect, then with the shifting patchiness of the landscape, the leks move with that patchiness, and so it's a much more under a different management regime that we think is kind of maybe sort of approximating, that original system. The chickens are acting in a much different fashion. So
that's really interesting.
Yeah. So, and they're an interesting species because within several months, especially during their reproductive cycle, they need very different patch types. So those females, what we've found, and this is a lot of work that Sam and his students have done especially with prairie chickens and grassland birds. So Sam, correct me, but my recollection is the females, where a hen comes in to breed, she typically 95% of the time or so, she will nest within about a 2-kilometer radius of that point.
Yeah.
And so as a land manager, the challenge is then, okay, where are you providing nesting cover? She's not going to want to nest in that real short profile patch. She needs covers. They're ground nesting birds, of course, about the size of a football. So typically what those hens are looking for is patches on the landscape that have several years of residual thatch, a lot of good cover. Then once her clutch hatches, a lot of times apparently that real thick nesting cover that the hens select for in terms of the nesting phase, apparently a lot of times that's too thick for the little chicks, the little puffballs, to be able to effectively navigate. And they need really good access to bugging. They've got to be able to get, especially grasshoppers, fairly quickly for both protein and moisture. And so if they're in a patch that has really thick vegetation, they'll just get exhausted and die. So sometimes immediately after they're all hatched, the hen takes them to a patch that's 1 or 2 years post-disturbance that has a lot of forbs, a lot of broadleaf plants, a little bit of cover, overhead cover, like a little miniature forest, probably some cover from aerial predators, but also from the elements. And so that's where the chicks do real well in terms of having better bugging access through the vegetation. So chickens are telling us, as a land manager, if you want to effectively manage for chickens, you have to provide this heterogeneity or patchiness on the landscape.
Well, that's an interesting way, I think, to boil it down. It's not that the heterogeneity is increasing biodiversity. That's one thing that happens, but that heterogeneity is also needed by an individual species.
Right.
Just having proximate availability of these different types of structure in that system is pretty important. I talk about the same kinds of things in the deep south and forested systems, how important that heterogeneity is. And I talk about deer and turkeys all the time because the folks that I'm talking to normally are interested in those species. And then more and more since I've moved to Florida, they're interested in quail as well. But it's really interesting to hear that perspective essentially shared, it sounds like, by you guys and the way you think about the chickens.
Well, and it works for the others. I mean, you already know this, but it works for the others too. But it's not always heterogeneity driven by fire and grazing. So sometimes it may be less about the Pyric herbivory, but it's still a focus on heterogeneity, and it may be sort of how much brush is in an area, or whether you have big trees around. And that's what makes it really exciting for looking at large conservation areas. Is it's one thing if all you had to do was manage for white-tailed deer. That's pretty. I mean, it's not easy, but it's not horribly difficult.
Not compared to managing for 50 species.
Yeah, you start throwing a few more species in, and then all of a sudden you start to get bigger area, and you have to have roost sites for turkeys, but you can't have sites that chickens avoid because they don't like those big trees. And so some of that, I don't know, I'm sure you may have seen the paper we had by Evan Tanner, even just looking at quail surviving, bobwhites surviving the winter and summer heat and cold. They use different habitats and
and they're moving around.
Yeah,
so I think that's been really cool work, and would love to talk to you in depth about that at some point. But the thermal heterogeneity stuff, where we're just creating different microclimates for giving animals the opportunity to choose to get out of the heat. I mean, I get under I live in Florida, and it gets hot down here. And sometimes I want to get under a tree to get in the shade, right? And you're basically taking that concept out there and thinking about that as a resource, having shade or
and if they put a GPS collar on you, you might not use that tree very often, but when I do,
it's important.
Really important. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, that's interesting. Well, I think this has been great, guys. It's really eye-opening to get your perspective on things, and I think a lot of the concepts translate pretty well to folks that have forested systems, or maybe if they have old fields or something down in this part of the world. I actually grew up in the Black Belt Prairie, so I can relate to it a little bit from that. But it's really interesting to get that, and I really appreciate you guys coming on and talking to the listeners. It's been a great time.
Yeah.
Glad to do it.
Yeah, a lot of fun. Y'all need to come out and see the Great American Prairie. Yeah.
Yeah. I agree.
Yeah. Great. Well, thanks, Marcus.
Yeah, thank you very much.
We appreciate it. Fire University is part of the Natural Resource University podcast network, funded by the Renewable Resources Extension Act. If you like what you heard today in this episode, please follow us on all the social media platforms at UF Deer Lab.